Hi, I'm Jake, and this is episode 9 of Jake Makes Food. Today we're gonna be doing a little bit of a special edition. We're actually gonna be making beer. Now, if you've never made beer before, that might sound really intimidating, and that's probably why you haven't tried to do it yourself, but in all reality, it's actually pretty simple. If you can make bread, if you can cook soup, you can make beer. So we're gonna be doing that today. We're gonna be making a Brut IPA, kind of a simple version of it, and I'm excited to see what you guys think. Stay tuned. All right, so what we have here is we have a 10-gallon pot. We filled it with about 2 gallons of water, and we're bringing that up to around 155 degrees Fahrenheit. We have a digital thermometer here just to kind of give us a rough idea of the temperature. It's almost there, it still needs a little bit more time. So while we're waiting on that, we're going to start putting our steeping grains into our grain bag. All right, so as you can see, we've added our steeping grains to our bag, and we've basically just made a giant tea bag that we're gonna make our beer tea with. So we have our pale malt and our flaked maize. We're gonna tie this off like so and steep it in our beer. And I like to kind of just puff it up a little bit so that some water gets in there. All right, so now we're back. We've let our grains steep. I've removed them, drained them, and then rinse them. So now that we've done that, we're gonna raise our temperature, bring this up to a boil, and then move on to the next step where we add our malt extract. All right, so we've cranked up our heat. As you're gonna see, this is gonna start rumbling here pretty soon. The reason I have this burner is because it really speeds this part up. After I rinsed the grains, I added water to bring it up to about 2.5 gallons, which is what this particular recipe calls for. Some recipes will call for a 3-gallon boil, some will call for a 2-gallon boil. It just really depends on the recipe that you're making. This particular recipe calls for 2.5 gallons, so that's what I brought it up to. All right, so one reason why it's nice to brew outside is you're gonna notice all this foam. That foam is from all the proteins from our steeping grains. And you can't have a boil over, so it's nice to have a bigger pot and also to brew outside. It's pretty easy just to blow down, honestly, so don't worry too much about it. All right, so now that our grain tea is boiling, what we're gonna do is we are going to add corn sugar. And this is called DME, or dry malt extract. If you were doing an all grain batch, you basically would cause the grains to release their sugars through that process. Because we're doing what's called an extract brew, that sugar has already been extracted from the grains for us. In this case, it's dried out. You can also get liquid malt extract. This is way easier in my opinion. There's benefits to both, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna add this. It's gonna save us some time, and this is more of a beginner approach. It's honestly as far as I've ever gone. I don't do all grain personally. I know a lot of people that do. It's not really that much harder. It's just an extra step that I've never bothered with. So we're gonna add these in, we're gonna stir it, and we're gonna bring it to a boil again and boil it until our next step. All right, now we're gonna add our dry malt extract. And once this is in there, we're gonna stir it pretty much right away because it does tend to get clumpy. All right, and we have our sanitized spoon. All right, so with this particular recipe, it asks you to boil for 50 minutes before our next step. So now that we've got this boiling, we're gonna keep it going until there's 10 minutes left in our 60-minute boil. So we're gonna do 50 minutes on the heat. We're gonna add the rest of our malt extract, and then we're gonna add some hops. We'll come back in just a little bit and check on this after it's been boiling for about 50 minutes. All right, so it has been 50 minutes into our 60-minute boil. We are going to add the rest of our dry malt extract. This is light malt extract. So we're gonna add this. This is 3 pounds, so that'll be a total of 4 pounds in there. And we just wanna be careful that we don't have a boil over, so we're gonna pour it in and then start stirring it in. The steam will kind of cause it to clump up pretty quick, so that's why I just dump it in. It basically turns like a hard candy almost, like instantly the second it gets wet. So I'll take the camera off and show you what it looks like. So once you add that dry malt extract, this thing is gonna be like wanting to boil over like crazy. So just make sure you're adjusting the temperature anytime it starts to get too puffed up, which it's about to do right now. And that'll help it come down, similar to like if you're boiling pasta or something like that. Because this is a very sugary, hot, boily mess. So the last thing you wanna do is have it boil over, because this amount of sugar, you're not getting it off of stuff for a long, long time. So keep an eye on it until you get that rolling boil back, and then you're good to go. We're gonna add some hops here in a second. I wanna get this thing going a little bit more before I add those, because hops are another thing that can kind of kick it into that foamy process. There are chemicals and spray bottles and things you can use to keep it down too. I'm not gonna really bother with that today, but if you know how to keep foam down on pasta, you're gonna do basically the same thing with this. All right, so now that our wort is boiling, which I haven't mentioned what that is, once you've added the extract, you have basically taken it and made it wort. So what I have here is some Centennial hops. So just so you can kind of see what these look like. So these are Centennial hops. Smell really good. These are just little hop pellets that are made from the actual hop plant. So if you haven't ever seen a hop, basically this looks like a little baby green pine cone. So we're gonna pour the rest of these in. Like I said, this is another time you wanna watch your pot just to make sure that it doesn't boil over. And we're gonna let these boil for 10 minutes before we end our boil process, and we move on to the final stage of the brewing process, which is gonna be adding our Whirlpool Hop Edition. Our boil is now done. We're gonna shut off the burner and allow the wort to come down to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it's hit that, we're going to do what's called a Whirlpool Addition. I didn't really talk about this earlier, but basically when you're boiling the wort, that's extracting bitterness from the hops. It's also extracting some flavor and aroma and that kind of thing. The further towards the end of the boil that you are, the more flavor and aroma you're gonna get. So because we're gonna be shutting off the heat altogether, that's gonna basically just pull out raw aroma and some flavor as well from our hops, but basically no bitterness, okay? And so that's just gonna give it all the flavor and aromatics of really, really delicious IPA without some of that characteristic bitterness that you might have had in some other versions. So what we have is an ounce of Azaka hop pellets. We have an ounce of my favorite hop, which is Mosaic hops. And we have an ounce of a hop I've never personally used before. It's Idaho 7J007. I've never used it before, but that's what came in this recipe. So we're gonna put these in after we shut off our heat and bring it down to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we're gonna wait 20 minutes. After that, we're gonna transfer it to our sanitized fermenting bucket. And I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about that once our wort is ready. All right, so this has a couple minutes more left in the Whirlpool, and you'll notice that these are wet. Okay, I have some scissors here. The reason why they're wet is because I've sanitized them, as well as our fermenting bucket, our airlock, all that kind of stuff has been sanitized in a combination of water and sanitizing solution. I use, I believe it's like One Touch or something like that. One Step. There's also a brand called Star San, which is a liquid that you add to water to sanitize. But basically you wanna make sure everything that is touching your wort after the boil is sanitized. If it's not, you're not just risking an infection in your beer, you're almost guaranteeing it. So my hands are sanitized, the scissors are sanitized, my yeast packet is sanitized. Anything that's gonna be touching or going into our beer after it is done boiling has to be sanitized. I have a little bit of water here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start our yeast starter while we start to cool down our beer. So we're gonna do this similar to what we would do with bread. And I put some sugar water basically in here just to kind of get our yeast alive and kicking and get that process started where they're eating through sugar before we add it into our actual beer here in a minute. So like I said, I have our room temperature water here. I have our yeast. We're just gonna pour that in. And we're gonna let this start to just kind of go through the sugar, wake up, get its juices flowing, and add it to our beer in just a little bit. All right, so we have our beer, we have our bucket that has been completely sanitized, and we're going to just try not to burn ourselves. As you can see, it's still a little warm, so we're gonna be cooling it off, but pour this in. Okay. We're gonna go in, we're gonna bring this volume up to 5 gallons, which is what this recipe calls for. That's gonna help cool it off. And then I do have a wort chiller that I'm gonna use. If you wanna know a little bit about wort chillers, basically what it is it's a coiled system that runs water through it. You hook up one end to a tap, and then the other end drains it. Works similar to like an air conditioning unit, I believe, or like a heating system, whatever. The copper tubing and the cold water rushing through that pulls the heat out and cools it off a little bit faster. I'm not gonna show that on film just because most people aren't gonna have that. You can use ice, honestly, to bring the temperature down, but you wanna bring the temperature down to about like 70 degrees, just so that when you add your yeast to this, it doesn't kill it off right away. So we're gonna take this inside and get it chilled, and then we'll add our yeast. All right, so I have our lid here. I have, it's a airlock that basically has a bubble system that lets air escape. This is gonna be creating CO2 and alcohol. So the way this works is it basically is an air trap where air can get out, air cannot get in. And that's really, really crucial. The key here is to make sure that everything that comes into your contact with your bucket, your beer, whatever, any utensils, anything you use is sanitized.